Hi, everyone, and welcome to our third presentation session of our virtual Nature Summit webinar series. Today we have Josh Lillpop with us. He is the Natural Areas Branch Manager for the Office of Kentucky Nature Preserves, and he's going to talk about prescribed fire as a management tool on our natural areas. Before I hand that over to Josh, I'm going to do a quick little presentation about who we are and what we do as an agency. Hang tight. All right, Josh, can you tell me that you can see my screen?
Yep.
Perfect. So we are the Office of Kentucky Nature Preserves. We're the agency putting on this webinar series this week. And we are a state government agency in the Energy and Environment Cabinet. Here's a list of our duties by KRS statutes. And to sum all of these up into a general kind of statement is, we are in the business of acquiring land to protect it because it has rare or endangered species on it. It's a really rare or unique habitat type left here in Kentucky. We provide recreational opportunities for the general public, and just to overall collect data and information on our natural areas. So with that, we have several natural areas across the state that we own and manage ourselves. But in addition to that, we have several programs that we partner with other agencies, state agencies like state parks, Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife Resources, Division of Forestry, and non-government groups as well. And so in total, we have involvement on about 130,000 acres across the state of Kentucky, which is quite a lot. So in our agency, we have a few branches. Our Natural Areas and Conservation Management branch, which Josh will go into more detail later, is tasked with making management decisions on our natural areas based on data that we've collected and best management practices. And so we try to restore and conserve the natural area for rare and endangered species. Our Biological Assessment branch is tasked with collecting inventories on our natural areas, on new properties that we acquire, but also continuing to update old records in Kentucky. And we have the state's leading plant monitoring program. And we also do a lot of environmental education and outdoor recreation opportunities. That has come to a halt kind of since 2020 with COVID, but thank goodness for technology and our ability to continue to connect with the general public. With all that data and information that we collect on the natural areas across Kentucky, it is stored in our Kentucky Biological Assessment tool, which is readily made available on our website. And the reason that we are here today, we started planning an in-person event called the Kentucky Nature Summit at Pine Mountain State Park back in 2019. We were about 4 months out from the event when COVID hit, and so we had to cancel, and it's kind of been put on hold, and it's to be determined. But this event was a three-day long event with several field trips led by experts from multiple agencies. And so we wanted to host this mini webinar series to kind of cover some of the topics of the things that we would have, been experiencing and doing at this nature summit. And one day maybe we'll have it in person. And now I will turn it over to Josh. Give me 1 second to make you the presenter. And you should have screen sharing abilities now. And before we start, I wanted to let everyone know that there's a questions bar, a typing box that you should all be able to see. And I encourage you throughout the entire presentation to type your questions in. I will have them answered at the end. You do not have to wait to the very end to ask your questions. So feel free to utilize that throughout the entire presentation. And it's over to you, Josh.
All right. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. Good evening. Glad to be here. Fire is something that's been a part of my career since I started, and it's been a pretty important tool that we use to manage natural areas in Kentucky. And so I'm excited to talk to you all and hopefully shed a little light on why we do that and get you interested in prescribed fire and some of the positive effects that it can have on our natural communities. So jump right into it here. We'll start off by looking at Kentucky now. And this map is a little bit old. If we updated this, we might see a little bit more red, a little less green there. But this is kind of the state of the land or the habitat in Kentucky at this time. We got a lot of agricultural and open land, a little bit of forest land in the southeast there, a few wetlands around, but we're seeing a lot of red there. And so a few years ago, when we made this map, we also made a depiction of what we thought Kentucky looked like prior to European settlement. And we came up with something like this. And so you can see we got these grasslands, pre-settlement forest land, woodland, savanna, wetlands, and major rivers as kind of the major land type cover that we used to classify the land at that time. And I just want to point something out here. You know, you see the yellow grasslands here surrounded by woodlands and savannas. The same thing, it kind of comes up into this area. The inner and outer bluegrass show this woodland savanna, which a woodland, for those of you that aren't aware, a woodland is a more open canopy forest. So there's definitely trees on it. You would say, wow, that's a forest. But then when you walked into it, you would say, man, there's a lot of sunlight that comes to the forest floor, and that the diversity of the understory at ground level is going to be full of grasses and forbs and lots of herbaceous things. And so for our discussion tonight, we're going to classify those woodlands as a type of grassland because they essentially are. They support grassland, sun-loving species in the understory because of the openness. Savannas are similar to woodlands, but they're much larger. The distance between trees is greatly increased. And if you looked at any small portion of a savanna, you might call that a grassland. But when you look at that in this larger complex, that's what really creates the savanna. And so one thing, you know, I want to compare here or show you, Maddie shared a map earlier of the areas that we work on. And we are tasked with preserving Kentucky's natural heritage, which is all the plants and animals and natural resources and features that were here prior to, you know, humans moving in and starting to affect that change. And so if we look at that map, one thing that you kind of notice is that a lot of our natural areas seem to fall in the same key areas that we identify as grasslands, woodlands, and savannas in the pre-European settlement. And that's important. There's a reason for that. And we'll go more into that as we move along. But as Maddie said, I'm the branch manager for our natural areas branch, and we got staff that are out on these sites every day making decisions, looking at the species information and making determinations on what action needs to be taken to preserve these communities. And so we'll start our discussion tonight about fire. Looking at this sandstone limestone barren complex, this is a site that we own out in Hardin County. It's a really interesting site that has a lot of diversity across the site. And the reason I show this photo is I want to back up a step before we really start talking about fire and how that can be used to manage sites. There's a couple of ecological concepts or theories that we need to understand so that our discussion tonight makes sense. And I think that this picture illustrates one of those very well. When we talk about succession of a natural community, we refer to this natural progression of all land to go from a grassland to a shrubland to a mature forest. It's a natural process that occurs over time. And there's lots of reasons why that happens that we're not going to go into tonight. But it's important that you understand that the natural process of any grassland is to eventually succeed into a shrubland or a forest over time. And so here's a nice little infograph, if you will, that kind of shows this. And so when we talk about succession, we can talk about primary succession, which is taking basically rocks with no soil, mosses and lichens moving into that area, slowly starting to build and improve soil quality. Then the pioneer plants, the annual little herbaceous flowers and things and grasses move in, and then eventually perennial grasses and plants and so on and so forth until we eventually reach this climax forest. And so if every natural system moves along this gradient of succession, then what makes a grassland stay a grassland? What makes a shrubland stay a shrubland? How does that happen? And so to understand that, we need to talk about something called ecological disturbance. Disturbance is just an intense environmental stress that occurs over a very short period that essentially changes the ecosystem in some way. It can affect the spatial distribution, and what we mean by that is it can affect the way that the species or components of that particular habitat type are arranged. So it may remove some trees, it may encourage trees in other areas, it may encourage grasses in some areas, so it can kind of rearrange that arrangement across the landscape, or it can change the species composition. So a disturbance event, an ecological disturbance, could encourage one particular species over another species. The lack of disturbance over time could encourage that first species to become dominant and the other species that depends and is adapted to disturbance to become less common in the system. So essentially these disturbances change the character of the ecosystem. And so if we think about succession as this gradient that all habitat types are moving along, and we wonder why some things stay the way they do, it's typically associated with disturbance in some form or fashion. And those can be flooding events, tornadoes, wildfire, trampling. When we talk about that, we have some species in Kentucky, such as the running buffalo plover, which was just delisted by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which is a great accomplishment, and the Short's goldenrod. Both of these species have some relationship to trampling. When herds of buffalo moved through the area, there were large numbers. They were heavy animals. If it was wet, they were causing disturbance. And these disturbances act as this ecological driver that kind of changes or allows certain types of vegetation to persist in an area and not move along that gradient of succession. And so other things could be insects. If we look down here in this bottom right corner at this picture, you see these dead standing trees up here, and that was caused by a pine beetle outbreak in the late 90s that happened in Kentucky. And we'll, if we've got time later, we'll dig into that a little bit more. The top right corner here is ice damage. So if we think about ice acting as an ecological disturbance, ice comes in, it builds up on the branches break. That causes more sunlight to reach the forest floor underneath of those trees. That in turn can influence the species that occur underneath that tree, where once it was shaded, it's now allowing light down. And so these are the types of things that we're talking about that allow us to, or that naturally occur to keep certain types of habitat in a set state, as a grassland, as a shrubland, as a mix in between that. So our ecosystems are constantly moving along this gradient. Sometimes it's a drastic change. If it's a really heavy disturbance that's on a large landscape type scale, sometimes it may be minor. One species that we work with, Drosera, the sundew, is a very small, about the size of a penny, plant that its disturbance event that seems to maybe give it an advantage over other species is associated with crayfish. So the crayfish digs a hole, turns the dirt up there. That in turn seems to have some type of relationship with the Drosera, where it is able to persist in thick grasslands when those crayfish seem to be associated with it. Now, that's something that Jim Krupa at the University of Kentucky is looking into a little more, and something that we're studying also. We don't fully understand it at the time, but that is a minor disturbance that's having a direct effect on a single species. What we're talking about with fire and tornado and wildfire is more of a landscape or larger type disturbance that's affecting a community. And when I say community, a community is an assemblage of plants and animals, specifically plants that occur in a certain area and kind of create that normal picture of what the community looks like. And those are influenced heavily by the type of soil, the geology, its aspect, its sun exposure, the weather. There's lots of factors that go into that. But in studying communities and studying the type of vegetation that occurs across different latitudes and longitudes across the state and within areas of the state, we can start to get a feel for, based on the soil and the weather and the aspect, what type of community could occur there. Now, the community that occurs there is going to be dependent upon, in a lot of parts, the type of disturbances that have happened over history, as well as any anthropogenic or human disturbances that have come since settlement. So, but tonight we want to focus on prescribed fire as a disturbance and as a tool to help managers, especially nature preserves here, preserve those natural communities that are in those intermediate successional stages. So those grasslands that are wanting to become forests without the natural fire regime that used to exist in Kentucky, we've got to introduce that disturbance to help maintain that successional stage. And so why is that important? Well, we've had some ecologists and biologists look at our data and look at the species associated with that, and they found that 60 to 65% of the rare species and natural communities tracked by our office are associated with a grassland community that needs some level of disturbance to persist. And so again, when we talk about grassland communities for the purposes of this presentation, we're talking about prairies, which are the deep-soiled, large, grassy areas that most people think of when I say the term grassland. We're talking about barrens that may have more mixed in trees and shrubs and be a really diverse area that has a lot of grassland species but changes constantly and is really heavily dependent upon disturbance to persist. We're talking about glades, smaller grassland type areas with shallower soils or poor soils, woodlands, which we talked about earlier, and savannas. Sorry, I clicked the wrong button here. So let's go back to our map here for a minute. And so I've already kind of touched on the fact that our grasslands are going to need disturbance in order to persist. And if we think about this map and we think about the fact that we've got historical grasslands here, up into Hardin County and up towards the Ohio River and the inner and outer bluegrass, and then again in the Cumberland Plateau, this kind of area here, if you can see my cursor, hopefully is what we consider the Cumberland Plateau. And all three of these areas have, what we consider rare, plant rarity hotspots. And so this is another map that we used with our rare species data to kind of look at and see where are the areas where we find the most rare species in one location or within a certain buffer, if you will. But if you look at this map again, hopefully you can see my cursor here. We kind of see this U shape coming through the Bowling Green area up through E-Town and Hardin County towards the Ohio River. We kind of see this large conglomerate of dots here where the inner and outer bluegrass meet. We see a lot of information has been collected, and there's a lot of hot spots along this Cumberland Plateau area. And then the same thing again down here in Pine Mountain. And that all makes sense with what we've already talked about, that 60 to 65% of our plants need disturbance. We're finding the most rare or state threatened species in these same general areas. And so all that kind of overlaps together to say that these are the parts of the state where historically there was disturbance. Most of the time that was probably in the form of fire. And that's probably where we need to be implementing fire now if we're going to preserve these species for future generations to appreciate. And so a few years ago, Julian Campbell, who's a botanist in the state, he did some work looking at soils and looking at the land type associations. And basically what that did is gave us an idea of where fire was probably more common in Kentucky based on the perceived past vegetation and structure. And we can use things like coring of trees to look at past fire events to match that up. We can use that then to match and see how big a fire was If we're finding fire markers in the tree rings, 10, 20, 30 miles apart from the same time period, there's a pretty good chance that that was either just a really bad fire season, and there were multiple fires across the state that affected large acreage blocks, or that maybe there was one fire that came through that really, burned for a long ways because nobody was there to put it out. And so, again, we're finding these hot spots where there was probably fire occurring, where most of our rare species are at. And so that's the areas where we're working in and where we're implementing fire at. So let's define some terms here to make sure that we understand the difference. So wildland fire, according to the U.S. Forest Service, is any non-structural fire other than a prescribed fire that occurs in a wildland. And a wildland is just a natural area, trees, shrubs, grasses, etc. A prescribed fire, on the other hand, is any fire ignited by management action to meet a specific objective and includes a written and approved prescribed fire plan prior to that ignition. And so, I'm sure that all of you have seen the wildfires out west and the pictures on the news about, how that's going. And they always use the most dramatic photos for that. That's not what we're necessarily talking about with prescribed fire, though sometimes we do get aggressive with our fire tactics, but we're talking more about fires of this nature where we've got a low, slow-moving fire that's really just taking its time and doing its job. We'll get into a little bit more of this shortly, but I also wanted to point out that we write a burn plan for every burn that we complete, and that burn plan consists of a minimum of 12, but sometimes more than 20 pages. It's a legal binding document. There's attached to that document at least 6 to 8 maps that look at topography, smoke dispersal, where's your smoke going to go after you start burning, look at the presence of structures, the public, identifies the unit and where the corners are and what we want to burn, what we don't want to burn, etc. We have to contact the National Weather Service and receive a spot weather forecast, which is a very specific forecast that the Weather Service completes for us for a particular area based on a particular elevation, so that we can get a really good idea of exactly what the conditions are going to be that day. Because even though I'm not going to go into weather too much today, weather is a very important factor when it comes to determining when and how you're going to light your fire, and then ultimately how the fire behaves once it's been lit. We also complete a complexity analysis, which looks at the 13 items or different elements that are included in your legal document and evaluates those and finds mitigations to decrease the risk to personnel, public safety, or to not being able to successfully meet your objectives of the burn. There's a minimum of 2 emails and at least 3 phone calls that occur the morning of the day of the burn to notify local officials, state officials, and emergency personnel. And then all this goes through a peer review process and then requires signatures before it can be enacted. So this is not just a simple thing that's thrown together. This is often months in the planning, sometimes years in the planning, and it's a very detailed document that really gets at what are the specific variables that we need from the weather and the fuels and the ground moisture and all these things to try and achieve those goals that we want of creating an ecological disturbance that's going to have a net positive effect on the species or the plant communities that we want to manage. So, want to see, can I play? Yeah, let's see if I can play this video here. Okay, so I'm going to do a little talking. I'll play this video twice. When we talk about fire, we talk about a fire triangle. And every fire manager and every firefighter in the country understands the fire triangle. If any one leg of the fire triangle is missing, then the triangle becomes broken and the fire can be extinguished. And that's oxygen, basically in the form of wind, heat in the form of the spark or the fire that we start, and then fuel as in the form of the dry, fine dead fuels or dried woody fuels, or even sometimes live fuels that are carrying the fire. So what I want you to notice on this, there's three terms that I'll throw around a little bit as we move forward that I need you to at least have some bit of understanding, and that's the type of fire that we're talking about. So we can talk about a backing fire, which is going to be this fire at the top of your screen. If you look at this fire as it burns, the flames are pushing towards the black, not towards the fuel. The winds are coming from the bottom of our screen and moving to the top. So it's wanting to push this fire into the black. So when we have a backing fire, we get a very low, slow moving fire. That's typically where we start establishing black. If you don't have fuel, right, we've broke one leg of the triangle, and therefore we can control the fire there. Now, the other thing to look at is at the bottom here is what we call a head fire. If you notice, this fire jumps ahead of itself and continues to build in intensity as that happens, and that's caused by the wind pushing those flames over on fuels in front of them. So they're preheating those fuels, and then those fuels are igniting before the fuels behind them have burned out. And so when we look at a lot of the fire pictures that come out from wildland fires, or the really large, impressive, scary fires, those are typically head fires. They're tall flames, they're fast moving, they just look crazy incredible. The third thing I want to mention real quick is this flanking fire, which is over here on the side. This is a fire that is running parallel with the wind, so the flames are pushing it forward, but it's not very wide. It's not perpendicular like our head fire or our backing fire, where it's going to have a long line that's going to be affected by the wind. So a flanking fire can be used to put a higher degree of heat and cause things to burn a little bit hotter, but not move quite as fast as using a head fire. And so we use these basic principles along with our weather and our fuels and our moisture content, and we put all that together, and that's how we tactically go about setting these fires. Now, that's probably all I'm going to say about how we set fires. We teach 3-4 week-long courses on how to control and how to set and how to interpret what actually needs to happen. So we're not going to get into that too much tonight. But I do want to talk about how we can use fire and these basic principles, the idea of succession, the idea of needing a disturbance, and then the idea of these three different types of ways a fire can burn, to use it as a management tool that can help us meet our objective of conserving a particular natural community in a intermediate successional state. So we can use that lots of different ways, right? We've already talked about that fire can be used to maintain a particular state. If we look at the top left-hand corner here, we've got a grassland that's recently been burned. You can see a lot of the dead cedars and dead hardwoods that are there that were top killed or burned out by the fire. So over time, this grassland slowly started succeeding by having more and more woodies encroach on it, and we've used fire as a maintenance tool to knock those out of there. We can use it to control undesirable fire-intolerant species. So a fire-intolerant species would be any species that's not adapted or doesn't handle fire well. The opposite of that would be a fire-tolerant species. And so when we know those, and typically plants in a community, plants that are associated with each other in a plant community are all going to be either fire-tolerant or intolerant. There'll be some members that are opposite, and their presence will increase or decrease depending upon the presence or absence of fire over time. So we can use fire to do a couple things. Like in this picture right here, I know it's hard to see, but we completed a burn. We knew in our burn plan that we had some invasive species in there. These invasive species, yellow sweet clover or white sweet clover, they don't respond well to fire, but their seedlings, the seeds that they leave in the soil, they respond very well to fire. When you burn that duff off, you get rid of all that the vegetation above them. They seem to really like that, and they will just explode. Well, we can use that to our advantage if we have an invasive that's causing problems. As long as we know it's there before we burn and we're prepared for the actions that need to occur after that, we can use that fire to go in and release all that seed, control it when it's at a seedling stage and very susceptible to damage and control, and hopefully eradicate or control that from the plant community. So we use that for a lot of different invasive species. So typically, a lot of invasive species their mature adults don't necessarily respond well to the active fire. However, the seeds that they build up in the seed bank do. So we see that a lot. So we use this tool a lot in our evasive control. Some other things that we can do is we can use fire to improve site conditions for a particular species. And so in this top right-hand photo here, we've got this little herbaceous plant here with these 4 balls on top. This is a rattlesnake master, and this plant is associated with a globally rare moth that I'll show a picture of here in a second. And it's heavily associated with fire. It behaves more as a grass and seems to increase in numbers with repeated burning. So that's a very good thing when you've got a moth that depends on this plant to be able to use fire to improve the habitat and site conditions for this species to persist. Now, I'll throw out there with that because this moth is dependent upon this plant, and this moth is not very tolerable of fire at certain times of year, as managers, we have to weigh the options of when to burn and how to burn to ensure that while we propagate and encourage this plant, the rattlesnake master, to occur on the landscape so that there's refuge for this moth and its larvae to reproduce, we also have to be sure that we're not applying fire in a way that we would burn that species out. And so that gets into some of the complexities of when we decide to apply fire to control the successional stage. There's a lot of these other factors that come into play. And so a couple other things here to mention. We can help change the species composition, increase sunlight, prepare for chemical treatments. It's even being used now for fuel reduction. And a lot of you may have heard the term prescribed fire used when they talk about fuel reductions for Western prescribed fires. So now, some important considerations when we're talking about prescribed fire. Because I'm hoping to explain this in more broad terms that can be understood as to why we need fire in our grassland communities. There's a lot of aspects that I'm not going to cover in detail, and that's, things such as the animals, the insects, the soils, the air quality. All of these things are also affected by fire, and they can be positively or negatively affected by the fire. The way in which we apply that fire can have those effects, and there's things that we can do with a better understanding and working with our biologists and ecologists to understand how these species function, what their biology is. So there's ways that we can apply fire to hopefully avoid those negative impacts and make those positive impacts, because a lot of these species, just like the grassland, depend on fire disturbance in order to persist. Otherwise, they're basically shaded out. With the lack of that disturbance, we're going to continue to succeed into a mature forest. One thing we don't do is we never burn all of one particular habitat type at any one time. So if we have a 40-acre grassland and that's the only 40-acre grassland that we have within close proximity, we're going to cut that grassland in half, or we're going to cut it in thirds, maybe even fourths. And we do that to ensure that if we mess up in our prescription for the burn, say we planned on doing it on this day with these type of conditions, and we go out there and we light it, and we do that, and that wasn't the right time, and we had a really negative impact on something like this globally rare rattlesnake borer moth over here. We still have those other portions of that habitat type nearby that can help with recolonizing and also preventing us from losing that species. I can tell you this species of moth right here, though it doesn't look like much, it would be very easily, it only occurs in one place in the state, a site that we own, and we literally could wipe this species out from the entire state if we made the wrong call on when to apply fire to the system. At the same token, if we do not apply fire to the system, then this species will surely be lost over time too, because of the trees that would move in that would shade out its host plant. So we also have to consider for personnel and public safety. I mean, that's top of the list. And we have to plan for our fire to get out of the box. We say keep it in the box, keep it within the fire breaks, keep it within the area that we define in our burn plan as where we wanted to have these effects and where we wanted to apply this disturbance. But we have to plan every single time for what we're going to do if that gets out, because it happens. It doesn't happen a lot, thankfully, but it does happen. And when it happens, by having that plan, we're able to adjust to that and handle that safely and quickly. So that's some background information, some definitions. I hope I haven't lost you yet. And I want to jump into a couple of sites that we're managing, a couple of specific projects, and kind of just explain how we're using fire to meet our management objectives of ultimately preserving these natural communities, maintaining them in the successional state through the use of a disturbance event. So the first one we'll start here with is Crooked Creek State Nature Preserve in Lewis County. I'll go ahead and tell you that this nature preserve is open to the public. There is a hiking trail on it that you can go and hike on the trail, and it'll take you right by this burn unit that I'm getting ready to talk about. It'll also take you right by a more prairie-like unit, which is similar to this but void of the trees and the shrubs. It's starting to get some trees in there, and that's why we're going to be implementing a burn on that this fall. So this is a site where you can go and see for yourself firsthand the fire effects and what we've got going on and how we're using fire to manage these sites. So Crooked Creek, it's a large complex of a high-quality calcareous shale barrens and glades. So that's fancy ecological terms there. Basically, it's a large grassland complex that has pockets of wood, pockets of shrub, pockets of these open areas with grassland habitat underneath trees, and creates a really diverse habitat that allows for a lot of species to persist. As you can see from this photo, we've got a lot of trees starting to move in and grow up, and it's time for a disturbance event. So because this is going to be a maintenance burn, we've got relatively good structure to the barrens. We've got a lot of the species there that we want, but we're seeing woody things start to move in. They're starting to establish and get a hold on there. We're going to use a very low intensity, slow moving backing fire to achieve our management goals here. And so the reason we do that, and this is just a little video here, you can see, you look in the background, there's some large trees, but they're relatively far spaced out. And most of the younger trees and the understory cover is these young, small saplings, size of your finger to maybe 3/4 or an inch. Right. Well, this slow-moving fire allows us to increase what we call the residency time, and that's the time or amount of time that fire stays on the base of a stem. And that's what's actually going to offer the control. So this video here, watch the fire and try to pick a spot close to where the flames are at, and watch how much the flames actually move across that spot. So if we're looking here, it's burning this leaf, this little stick next to it, we're putting a lot of heat on this stem, and it's moving very slow. And this slow-moving backing fire is very easy to control. It offers a lot of great control on these woody stems. It'll cause this top to die. Depending on the sugars and carbohydrates and all the nutrients that it has stored in its root system, it may resprout and start growing from the ground again. And it may take another fire event to completely kill that out. If our timing's right, our conditions are right, you may be able to drop some of the stems out with this one fire event. But all this leads to creating this open complex here of shrub and grassland habitat that hosts a lot of diversity of species and a lot of rare species. So you can see several different types of liatris on this site. We've got the Indian paintbrush. You can see all the sunflowers here. There's a big blue stem back here in the back. It looks like maybe some prairie dog here. All species that are indicative of a fire-maintained grassland system, mixed amongst a bunch of post oak, blackjack oak, hardwood trees that can tolerate some degree of fire. So that's how we're using it for maintenance. I want to move into a little bit bigger project. Check my time here. So, okay. Move a little faster through this. But this is a forest in Pulaski County. You can see it's got extremely high density of stems in here. They're bigger. This area here has gone a lot longer without disturbance. and is moving from a woodland to more of a closed canopy forest. And one thing that we've noticed is every time we get an opening, we start to see these sun-loving plants occur. And so that's kind of positive that it's reassuring that this once used to be more open system. And so we looked at a study out of Tennessee that saw that after 65 years of fire suppression, when they started implementing fires and creating canopy gaps, a lot of these prairie grassland species started reappearing in the understory under these trees. So that's further encouragement that we're on the right track with wanting to open this up. So we go through and we clear the mid-story out. We drop those stems. We treat them with herbicide summer 2019. In the spring of 2021, after a year and a half of drying and curing of those stems, we come in and we complete a prescribed fire on this site. This is aftermath of that fire, about I think maybe 4 or 5 days after the fire happened. We've completely consumed everything in the understory. We've removed a lot of the woody debris from all the stems that we've cut down. And here it is in July, just 8 weeks after the burn occurred. And you can see the trees are greening up. The grasses and other herbaceous things are starting to grow in here, which is exactly what we want. And as we begin to implement further fire events in here, we're going to have more fuels at the ground level. We're going to continue to open this canopy up. And eventually we can get back to that more preferred and historic pine oak barrens that supports a diversity of birds, of plants, of insects, pollinators, all these things, because we have this rich grassland understory underneath these pines. And one other thing that we were able to do, we successfully in this fire top killed almost every maple tree that was over 2.5 inches. And so that right there is going to allow these stems that are still standing to dry and cure over the next 2 years. It's going to resprout down here at the ground. That's fine. But as these dry and cure and they fall down, they're going to build up the fuel load. There's going to be more fuel there to increase the heat there. And when we come back in 2023 or 2024 and burn this again, we're going to further damage and further injure these maples. And eventually, it should be after this next fire event, they should start to drop out and get us to a structure that looks more like this. Now, this structure here, after the next burn, I expect to see a lot more holes in the canopy, a lot more grasses coming in there. So, very interesting project. How am I doing on time here? So, I think maybe I'll forgo my last site here and jump down to the end so we get time for questions. I do want to leave you with a couple of resources in case you're interested in fire and want to explore more. The Joint Fire Science Program does a great job of providing research briefs, which basically they read the scientific journals, they pull out the important parts, paraphrase that, and put that in a simple 2-page document that explains to manager or someone interested in fire exactly what that study says. And so we use this a lot at my office. I'm constantly utilizing them for research. They're a great resource to provide information. And we're covered by 2 different regions here, the Oak Woodland Forest Fire Consortium and the Consortium of Appalachian Fire Managers and Scientists. I think we'll send an email out with these links so that you'll have that after the presentation's done. And then the last resource that I want to share with you is the Kentucky Prescribed Fire Council. I'm the current president of the board there, and we're trying to make a lot of push over the next year or 2 to offer more trainings to get people more involved in fire. So if you're interested in actually getting out on a fire, you have land and are interested in learning how to burn that land, we've got a couple courses coming up, and you can visit kyfire.org to learn more about that. I will say, and just provide this disclaimer today, that I hope that I've at least introduced you to how fire can be a positive management tool. But I hope I've also demonstrated enough that it's important to have the training and the understanding before you go and apply this. I've talked at a very high level about fire and how it can be used. There's a lot of intricacies and details and variables that come into play on this. And so I just don't want anybody to think that they're going to go right out and light a fire and change their closed canopy forest into an open grassland. At the Fire Council, we're happy to help you learn how to do that. I just ask that you seek out those resources and do the homework to make sure that you're applying that in the right way, because it can be negative if it's not applied properly. So, and with that, I'll leave you with a beautiful picture here of a fire we did right at dusk on one of our larger remnant grasslands here in the bluegrass region, and leave you with a few takeaways that hopefully you understand that grassland systems are imperiled in Kentucky. They're a very diverse group that require disturbance to be maintained, and we've got to find a way to allow that natural disturbance to occur, whether it's us implementing it or allowing, finding other ways to do that. Otherwise, we'll lose these communities, and when we lose those, we'll lose a lot of the insects, the plants, the birds, all the animals that depend on those communities to persist. So, and with that, I think that we're on time, and I'll leave it open for questions. We got any?
We do. Thanks, Josh. And like Josh said, you can contact him for any further questions about the council or the resources he sent out. I will also send an email out to everyone who registered for this presentation, those links and resources as well. And you're also welcome to email me. I forgot to introduce myself at the very beginning, but I also an employee of Nature Preserves. I'm a land manager and outreach specialist, and I'm also involved with Prescribed Fire and the council. So our first question is, what is the #1 cause of habitat destruction for these rare and endangered species?
The #1 cause. I mean, that's hard to say because each site's different, but when we're talking about grasslands, I think that it could be simply said as much as that we haven't allowed the proper disturbance regimes to exist. We've either put fires or we're mowing, mowing is a disturbance event that could replicate fire to a degree, but we're mowing at the wrong times of year. We're not allowing fires to burn at the right time, and those things are going to succeed through into woody species coming in. So, the key to grasslands is the disturbance. And that's hard because not everybody understands how to do that.
What birds are dependent on disturbance in grassland communities?
What birds?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, I guess if I made my argument well enough that all grasslands are dependent on disturbance at some point to persist, then any bird that would be dependent upon a grassland is also dependent upon fire in some form or fashion. So, I mean, bobwhites are kind of the classic example, but there's a lot of songbirds, kingbirds, northern harriers, that are strongly associated with grasslands. The grasslands just won't persist if we don't allow the disturbance event to occur.
Right. What about what comes to my mind is like predator, like hawks and kestrels and all that stuff, and falcons, the stuff that kind of depend on small mammals and stuff that use open grasslands, and for them to be able to hunt easier in the open grasslands. Is that accurate?
The Henslow sparrow is one that's driven grassland management in Kentucky for many years. And upon that, you get the bird species that they like having the burnout woody stems available to sit as perches and things, but if it starts becoming too woody, they can't see far enough, so they're not going to use the habitat. There's a lot of species that depend, whether directly or indirectly, on grassland fire regimes to maintain them as grasslands.
Yeah, cool. What is a fire break and how do you create one?
In simple terms, a fire break is an area that's void of fuel. So we'll use man-made fire breaks like roads and trails. We'll go in and use a leaf blower to remove leaf litter. You can use a weed eater to cut down grass to bare dirt, or a tractor and a tiller. We'll also use natural breaks like creek beds and rivers and streams, rocks, rocky outcrops. Anything that's void of material that will burn could be used as a potential fire break.
What is the best time of year to do controlled burns?
If you'd asked me that 10 years ago, I would have said it would have been in the spring, and that's definitely the time when we seem to do the most burning and have the best burn season. But the more we do this, the longer I've done it, the more I realize that variability in your burn season is best. And so, we have some sites that we've burned repeatedly in April. Sometimes five fire events over the last 20 years, and those seem to be getting really heavy in the warm season grasses. And so now we're making a switch, and we're actually moving to burning those in September and August, when hopefully the fire will have more of an effect on the grasses and thin those out and allow a lot of the herbaceous species to come in. But our general fire season in Kentucky, when fires will easily carry or when fuels and the habitat is conducive to fire, are typically going to be February to about the 15th of April. And then in the fall from October 1 through November 15th or December, something like that. Most of our historical wildfires, besides lightning ones, but that's typically when we think of fire season being is in the early spring or the late fall.
What happens to reptiles and amphibians when there's prescribed fire?
Yeah, so April 15th is a pretty hard deadline for me. And I've developed that over 15 years of burning and looking at research, talking to people. And the reason for that is that around that time, most of that stuff has fully come out and is much more prevalent on the landscape. It does happen that we find reptiles and amphibians burned on a fire. But in my career, I don't feel like it's an excessive amount. It's not something that I find on every fire I burn. A lot of those species are at that time of year when we're burning, the nights are still pretty cold. So they're staying pretty close to shelter, which is probably going to be underground where it's still warmer. And they seem to go underground or deter. And you have to remember too that just like the plants evolved with fire, all the animal and bird and insect species, they were around with it too. And so they recognize smoke. They recognize the need to get out of the way. And so it's a mental. And you have to look too, I always say you can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs. And the sad truth is that fire is a destructive event. And we are going to lose individuals in that fire. But the side effect of not allowing that disturbance means that we're going to eventually lose that habitat completely for the species. So you've kind of got to weigh those against each other.
I like that, the omelet reference, because I get asked that as well. I'm going to start using that.
Yeah, I'll say too, we typically don't, when we first started burning years ago and trying to figure this out, a lot of times we would ring the whole unit. We would put fire all the way around the unit, allow it to close in together. We spend a lot more time now just using the backing and flanking fires and let those consume the majority of the unit. And when we do that, it leaves an area for, the mammals and vertebrates and other things in there to hopefully escape over time.
Definitely. We have two more questions. How do you light the fires?
We typically use what's called a drip torch and use a mixture of 3-to-1 diesel to gas. And it's got a valve on it that prevents the fire from coming back up. And that just slowly puts out a small drip walk. That's our go-to method. In the last few years, we've really been learning a lot, pushing the boundaries known and trying to have better effects. And, I've used QZ. I've used Berry pistols, which shoot a projectile that ignites when it lands. I've used a rake and a lighter, a Bic lighter, and just light some leaves and then keep carrying the leaves down the line. That's how they do it on wildfires a lot of times. That works effectively. And earlier this year, I even went to a demonstration where they were using a drone to go out and ignite the fire. So any way you can get a spark, essentially, is how we're going to ignite it. But the drip torch seems to be the go-to and the easiest, what we all know.
So we have two more questions, but they're kind of the same question, but I'm gonna combine them and ask them. But what is your favorite prescribed fire project currently at OKNP? And what is your favorite prescribed fire story / anecdote?
So I guess my biggest success story, or the thing I'm most proud of, is can y'all still see my screen? Is this fire right here that we did. This was a fire that we've known for 20 years. We needed to have fire in this environment. We haven't been able to do it because of lack of trained personnel in the beginning, and then as time moved on, things like budget shortfalls, restrictions, loss of staff prevented that. And so this is one that's been 20 years in the making, and we finally got that pulled off this spring. We started this cut in the summer of 2019, and the fall of 2019, spring of 2020, fall of 2020, there were nights when I was up late looking at weather reports, planning, had people on standby ready to go. So it literally took us 2 years of watching the weather events before we got the right window and the right conditions for public safety and for ecological effects to pull it off. And that's one thing I've learned, is that if it don't feel right, we don't have to go today. We can wait and get another event, another window at another time. And so being able to pull off this burn this spring was a pretty big accomplishment, and something that I think, and a lot of our staff believe, is really going to be the catalyst for an extremely successful and impactful conservation project moving into the future. And hopefully that'll start a fire with other organizations to push the boundaries and try to attempt some of these things to restore these woodlands and pine barrens in the Cumberland Plateau. And my favorite fire story, I couldn't even begin to tell you. I've been doing this for 16 years, and every time I go out, I enjoy it and I have fun, and I still see stuff that I've never seen before. So yeah, it really is the best job for me. I'd probably be in jail as a pyromaniac if I didn't find this career path. So
Yeah, professional pyromaniac. That's what I tell my family. Thank you so much for this presentation. And again, Josh's email. Oh, one more question popped up. Oh, there's just people saying thank you. This was a great presentation, very informative. I just threw 3 links in the chat real quick. The first one is this registration link to sign up for our last presentation tomorrow, which is about geology and landforms in Kentucky. The second one is our Facebook page. If you want to find out more about programs, education opportunities, volunteer in-person events that we have, Facebook is usually where we announce that. And lastly, our YouTube channel. So if you know anyone that wanted to attend this session that was not able to, don't worry, they will all be, they were all recorded and they will all be up on our YouTube page. And a good way to keep track of that is to subscribe to our channel. And that way you will get a notification anytime a new video is up. So with that, we're going to close out. Thanks again so much, Josh, for this presentation. I hope everyone learned a lot, and we'll see everyone tomorrow.
Thanks. See y'all.
See ya.